Bismillah, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another tutorial. In today's lesson, we'll be able to go through what is meant by terms of trade. We'll discuss when does a country's terms of trade improve and when does it worsen, and obviously what is meant by improvements and worsening of terms of trade. And then probably in the next lesson, we'll be able to go through some of the consequences of improvements and worsening of terms of trade. I want to actually divide that, even though today's lesson will be a relatively shorter one, but I want to divide these two lessons because the consequences part is very important, especially for 12 mark essay questions. So again, inshallah, the aim is to divide these two lessons or two subtopics into two different lessons, so that it makes it easier for students to understand these concepts. So the first thing to note is actually what is terms of trade. So terms of trade is basically when a country is determining the value of its exports compared to the value of its imports, and it wants to see which are more valuable. Its exports are more valuable or its imports are more valuable. That is when we determine terms of trade. So terms of trade is actually defined as value of exports in terms of imports, and basically a comparison of the value of exports with the value of imports. And it is calculated using this formula. Terms of trade is export price index over import price index into 100. Right? This formula is very important for MCQs because very often in paper 1 you're asked one MCQ that basically asks you to calculate the terms of trade of a particular country. So you should know this formula. Price of exports, or export price index over import price index into 100. That is what is meant by terms of trade. That is the first thing that you should know. The second thing is, now let's see, when the value of a country's terms of trade is greater than 100, what does that mean? And when it is less than 100, what does that mean? So when the value of a country's terms of trade is greater than 100, that means the country has a favorable terms of trade, which means that the country's exports are more dearer and are more valuable compared to imports. That is why the terms of trade is greater than 100, right? Similarly, unfavorable terms of trade is when the value of the terms of trade is less than 100, so exports are of lesser value or are cheaper compared to imports. Now remember one thing. We can say that if a country, even though these terms are a bit misleading, so a lot of the time students see that favorable terms of trade means that these are beneficial and favorable for the economy, while favorable terms of trade are not beneficial and favorable for the economy. That is not necessarily true. We'll talk about when is improvement in terms of trade better, when is it bad, and and obviously when we'll talk about what so we'll talk about when is an improvement in terms of trade good or bad, and when is a worsening of terms of trade good or bad. We'll talk about that later on in probably the next class or in the next tutorial. But in today's lesson, again, the only focus of our attention right now is when is the terms of trade greater than 100. It is when the terms of trade of the country is favorable. And when is it less than 100? When it is unfavorable, when exports are cheaper than imports. And balanced terms of trade is obviously when the price of exports is equal to the price of imports. Right? Now, the more important thing is, rather than knowing when is a country's terms of trade favorable or unfavorable, the more important thing here to note and to know is what is meant by improvements in a country's terms of trade and what is meant by a worsening of a country's terms of trade. So when does a country's terms of trade improve and when does a country's terms of trade worsen? That is very important. Rather than, so it's more important to note and to know what causes improvements in terms of trade or worsening of terms of trade rather than the favorable and unfavorable aspect. Right? This is something that you should know for MCQs, but this is something that you should know for essay questions. This is very important. So, the first thing, when does a country's terms of trade improve? The first thing to note here is you should know what is meant by improvements in a country's terms of trade. Improvements in a country's terms of trade means that the value of the terms of trade is rising. Right? Now, what does this mean? This means that let's suppose if a country's terms of trade was 90 and it is now 97, even though it is still unfavorable because it is less than 100, but there has been an improvement in the terms of trade because the value has increased. So, improvements in terms of trade means that there is an increase in the value of the terms of trade. Doesn't necessarily mean that the country's terms of trade is becoming favorable. It's just that it is improving, right? The value has increased, right? That is what improvement in a country's terms of trade means. Now, when does an improvement in a country's terms of trade happen, basically? There are two main reasons behind that, and then we'll talk about two other subsidiary reasons. Right? So when does a country's terms of trade improve? Number one, when there is an increase in the price of exports. When exports become more valuable, as you can see from this formula, when the denominator increases because exports are becoming expensive or more valuable, that means terms of trade will rise, number one. Number two, when the price of imports decreases, that means imports become less valuable, they become cheaper. As a result, this denominator will fall, the value of the denominator will fall, which means that overall impact on terms of trade will be that there is an increase in terms of trade. Right? So when exports become expensive or when imports become cheaper, that is when a country's terms of trade is improving. Number three is, if exports are also becoming expensive and imports are also becoming expensive, then what? In that case, an improvement in terms of trade will happen when exports are becoming more expensive compared to imports, right? So an increase in the price of exports is greater than the increase in the price of imports, and in that case the numerator will rise by this much, the denominator will rise by this much, so the overall impact on the fraction will be that there will be an increase in terms of trade. While number four, what if exports and imports are both becoming cheaper? There is a global downturn and overall prices are falling. So exports are becoming cheaper, imports are becoming cheaper. In that case, improvements in terms of trade will be when export prices are falling by less than import prices. Export prices are falling, but import prices are falling even more, which means that overall the impact on the fraction will be an increase in terms of trade. Right? So improvements in terms of trade are due to these four major reasons. And again, what are the reasons behind their changes? Obviously, we'll focus on these two more often than the other two reasons, right? So the question might be, when will the price of export increase and when will the price of import fall? We'll talk about that here in this table. So we'll talk about that in a minute, right? However, before moving to that part of the chapter or of that topic, let's now discuss, when does a country's terms of trade worsen? Right? A country's terms of trade worsens when, number one, so firstly, a country's terms of trade worsens when the value of the terms of trade falls. Right? So let's suppose the value of the terms of trade is falling from 100 to 90. Right? That means the country's terms of trade is falling. Right? So the fall in the terms of trade or a worsening of the terms of trade is when the value of the terms of trade is falling, basically. Right? Now, what are the reasons behind those behind that fall in the country's terms of trade. Number one is when exports become cheaper. So when exports become cheaper, that means this numerator falls. Exports are now cheaper, their prices are low. As a result, terms of trade will fall. Number one. Number two, imports are becoming expensive. Prices of imports are rising, which means the denominator will increase, which would mean that the overall impact on the fraction will be a fall in terms of trade. Right? Now, what if exports and imports are both becoming expensive? So, exports are also becoming expensive and imports are also becoming expensive. In that case, it depends on whether imports are becoming more expensive or not, because a fall in the terms of trade or a worsening terms of trade will be when exports are becoming expensive but by less than the prices of imports. So imports are becoming more expensive compared to exports. As a result, the impact on import price is this much, while the increase in export price will be this much. So the overall impact on the fraction will be that there will be a fall in the terms of trade of the country. And number four is, what if exports and imports are both becoming cheaper? In that case, if exports are becoming more cheaper than imports, right? So export price index is falling by more than the import price index. So export price index is falling by this much, import prices are falling by this much. That means the overall impact on the fraction will be a fall in the terms of trade. Right? So these are the four major reasons behind worsening terms of trade. Now remember again, our major focus will be on these two. But you should know these. Similarly, our major focus on improvement in terms of trade will be this, but you should know these as well. Right? Now, the next question that we should know or that we should solve is, what are the factors that affect terms of trade? Now, these aren't factors that affect terms of trade. These are the reasons why terms of trade may improve or worsen for a country. And those reasons are basically based or dependent on export price index and import price index. What is the direction that these prices are taking? Whether the export price index is rising or falling, and whether the import price index is rising or falling, that will affect terms of trade. Now, the next question is, yes, we know that export price index rises, which causes an improvement in terms of trade. And we know that when import price index rises, terms of trade falls. The next question is, when does the export price index rise and when does the import price index rise? So basically, when we are looking at the causes or factors that affect terms of trade, we are basically determining what are the causes that will change the prices of exports and imports, which will ultimately cause the terms of trade to rise or fall. I have basically divided these factors. There are five main factors that affect terms of trade. I have divided these factors into two main categories: demand side and non-demand side. Demand side factors, demand side causes, which is one basically, and non-demand side causes, which are four. Right? So there are a total of 5 factors that affect terms of trade. Let's discuss these factors one by one. The first, as I said, the first major factor that causes a shift or that causes the terms of trade to improve or worsen are basically demand side factors. Now, what is meant by demand side factors? Demand side factors mean essentially the demand for exports or the demand for imports is changing due to any factor, right? When the demand for export changes, what happens to the terms of trade? When the demand for import changes, what happens to terms of trade? This is what we'll study here. Obviously, we won't be studying that what are the causes, what are the factors that cause a change in the demand for exports and imports. Obviously, they're non-price factors. We can talk about any different factors. For example, if foreigners' incomes are rising, right? If foreign incomes are rising, that means the demand for our exports will increase. While if local incomes are rising, that means the demand for imports will increase, right? Remember this. So, our concern isn't the factors that cause a change in the demand for exports and imports. Our focus is on what happens to terms of trade, number one, when the demand for export changes, and what happens when the demand for import changes. What happens to terms of trade? Number one, when the demand for export increases due to non-price factors, remember, again, these are non-price factors, right? So, when the demand for export increases due to non-price factors, what happens to the price of anything when its demand rises? Use a diagram to basically come up with the answer. As demand rises, price rises because there's a shortage, right? So when the demand for export increases, that means the price of exports will increase. And when the price of export increases, we know that the numerator of the terms of trade formula will increase. That means the terms of trade will rise. Simple. The terms of trade improve. However, what happens if the demand for import increases? If the demand for imports increases, that means, again, whenever the demand for something increases, the price of that product increases. So when the demand for imports is rising, that means the price of imports will increase. And when the price of imports increases, that means the denominator is now rising. That means the value of the terms of trade will fall. Right? So an increase in the demand for exports causes the terms of trade to rise because export prices are rising. Remember, make sure whenever you're writing something similar, you make sure that you include this. You don't simply move from here to here by saying when the demand for exports increases, that leads to an increase in terms of trade. That is an incomplete chain of analysis. You need to say that an increase in the demand for exports is causing the price of exports to increase, which causes terms of trade to rise. And obviously, for a better chain of analysis, you need to obviously also talk about why might the demand for exports may be increasing. Okay? When we're obviously talking about an increase in the demand for exports, the first thing that you may write in your analysis, which will give you better marks, is why might the demand for exports be increasing? Because maybe there might be increase in foreign incomes. Even one factor would do. You don't need to write multiple factors. Even one factor would do, right? While if the demand for imports increases, why might that be increasing? Because there is an increase in local incomes. So people want to spend more goods and services coming from abroad. So as a result, the demand for imports increases, which means the price of imports rises, and that causes a fall in the terms of trade. This is the accurate chain of analysis that you should be using for such an answer. Right? So these are demand side factors. Obviously, when there is a fall in the demand for exports, export prices will fall, which will cause a fall in the terms of trade. Similarly, when there is a fall in the demand for imports, import prices will fall, which will cause an increase in terms of trade. So everything will be reversed, right? So these are demand side factors. Now let's talk about non-demand side factors. The first non-demand side factor is what happens to the terms of trade when the supply of exports or the supply of imports increases. Right? So let's talk about this. Let's see. If the supply of exports increases, let's suppose Pakistan starts to produce more goods and services and wants to supply more goods and services to foreign countries in terms of exports. Whenever the supply of a product rises, we know for a fact that the price of the product falls because there's a surplus. Right? So when the supply of exports increases, that means exports are becoming cheaper, and when exports become cheaper, terms of trade worsens. Right? Because the numerator is falling, right? So terms of trade fall. While if the supply of imports increases, that means imports will become cheaper. As a result, the denominator is falling, which will mean terms of trade will improve. These are supply side factors. And you can obviously talk about any factor that may cause an increase in the supply of export. For example, why is supply of exports rising? Maybe because the government is giving us subsidies. Right? Anything. Right? You can write anything here. Alright? So this is supply side factors. The second non-demand side factor is inflation. If there is an increase in local inflation, if inflation in Pakistan is high, that means our exports are becoming expensive. When our exports are becoming expensive, that means the terms of trade is rising. Now, a lot of the time, students actually make this very common mistake. And the common mistake is they say that because the inflation is rising and as a result our exports are becoming expensive, and because of that increase in inflation, as our exports are becoming expensive, rather than looking at the impact on terms of trade, they say that the demand for exports will fall and that may lead to a fall in the terms of trade. That is incorrect. That is incorrect. You do not need to, or you do not have to look at the impact of that local inflation on the demand for exports. All you need to do is look at the impact of that inflation on the price of exports, and because that price of exports is rising, that means the terms of trade will rise because it is in the numerator. Right? While if foreign inflation in the foreign country rises, that means our imports will become expensive. As a result, our terms of trade will fall. Right? This is the second non-demand side factor. Number 3, exchange rates. If a country's exchange rate, so actually let's look at this. If a country's exchange rate appreciates, number 1, that country's exports become expensive for foreigners because the currency has become expensive. So when the currency is becoming expensive, that means the goods will become expensive for foreigners. And as a result, and at the same time, since our currency has become expensive, our imports will become cheaper to us because their currency is becoming cheaper for us. Right? So as a result, when their currency becomes cheaper, their goods become cheaper. That means our imports become cheaper. Both of these ultimately lead to an increase in terms of trade. Now, what is the common mistake that students make? They say that because an increase in exchange rate has caused the price of exports to rise, that means the demand for exports will fall. And because the import prices have fallen because they're becoming cheaper because our currency is becoming expensive, their demand will rise. As a result, the terms of trade will fall. Not at all. You're not supposed to go and look at the impact on demand for exports and imports just because the exchange rate has appreciated. All you need to do is look at the impact on the price of exports and imports, and that will ultimately decide what is happening to the terms of trade. Similarly, if there is a depreciation in the local currency, that will cause exports to become cheaper and imports to become expensive, and that will cause the terms of trade to fall. Right? So, an appreciation of the currency leads to an improvement in terms of trade. A depreciation in the currency leads to worsening terms of trade. And finally, tariffs. Right? Tariffs mean that import prices are becoming expensive. Right? Now, don't worry about their demand. Because import prices are becoming expensive, that means the terms of trade is rising. Simple. Because of an increase in tariffs, an increase in tariffs will cause a fall in the terms of trade. I don't know whether I've written rise or fall. So actually, let me draw this chain. So an increase in tariffs means imports are becoming expensive. As a result, the terms of trade will fall. Right? No need to look at the impact on demand for imports. That is something that is part of current account. Right? And whether it is good for the country's current account or not, but not on terms of trade. The terms of trade will fall. Now, whether this fall in terms of trade is good or bad, that is something we'll study in the next class, in which we'll study the consequences of increase in terms of trade and consequences of a decrease in terms of trade. That is something that we'll study in a lot of detail in the next class. But for the time being, I've given you an idea what terms of trade are and the causes of changes in terms of trade. Right. So in the next lesson, we'll be able to actually go through the consequences of increase and decrease in terms of trade. Till that time, Assalamu alaikum.